This original WSRE presentation is made possible by viewers like you. Thank you.
Katherine Clark on her oral biography about author Pat Conroy on this edition of Conversations. Katherine Clark first appeared on this program in 2016 to discuss her novels and writing career. During the conversation, we discussed her relationship with the renowned author Pat Conroy.
Actually, our friendship was one that took place over the telephone. We had a telephone friendship. And at one point he joked to me that if I'd been recording our phone conversations, I'd have a book by now. I thought, well.
You had to find time to tell me, right?
Yeah. But I will waste no further time, Pat. Actually, what happened is, so he said that, and then he had a health scare. This is about 3 years ago. And he nearly died in this health scare. He was in the hospital for 2 weeks. And came back from that, called me, and said, you know, it made me realize what's on my to-do list before I die. And one of the things is I want to cooperate with a biographer. I said, well, I'm not the one to do a scholarly biography. I'm just not oriented that way. I said, but I'd love to do with you what I did with Eugene Walter. He said, let's do it.
The result, Katherine's new book, My Exaggerated Life, Pat Conroy, is told to Katherine Clark. We welcome Katherine Clark back to Conversations. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me back, Jeff.
You know, we taped that interview. I believe it was like on maybe a Friday, and I think it was either that night or the next day Mr. Conroy passed away.
I went home that afternoon after we taped the show, and a few hours later I got the news that he had passed away.
Let me backtrack for just a couple of minutes. Tell me about how you first became friends with him. How did that relationship develop?
It happened over the phone. Right. I was asked to do an author profile of Pat for the Mobile Press Register, which is a paper I used to do book reviews and interviews and author profiles for. And my editor called me up one day and said, Katherine, would you like to do an interview with Pat Conroy? I said, gosh, let me think for a minute. Yes, I would love to do an interview with Pat Conroy, of course. So Pat's publicist from Doubleday set up this interview. And he told me that Pat was going to call me on a Friday. This was on a Wednesday that I was having the conversation with the publicist. And he said, well, give me your phone number. I will have Pat call you on Friday. So I get off the phone with the publicist, and all of a sudden I'm panicked. In 2 days I'm going to talk to Pat Conroy. Oh my gosh, I've got so much to do. I've got to reread all his books. I've got to make a list of questions for him. I've got to get batteries for my tape recorder. I've got to get my wits together. And also I have to figure out a way to tell him how much I love his works without sounding like a groupie. Right. But I calm myself down and tell myself, well, I have 2 days to do all this. Well, then the phone rings as I'm in a frenzy going around my study plucking his books off the shelves. Right. And I was thinking it was a telemarketer because I didn't recognize the number. And I pick up the phone and I have a very grouchy voice. Yes, who is it? Is this Katherine Clark? Yes, it is. Well, this is Pat Conroy. I'm like, oh my gosh. He said, I know I'm not supposed to call you till Friday, but I just got your phone number from my publicist, and I couldn't believe it. And he said, do you know I've been trying to reach you for 2 years? And at that point, I was thinking, you know, he has me mistaken for somebody else. Right, I can't imagine why he would be trying to find me for 2 years or why he would call me immediately upon getting my phone number. Right. But he apparently was a fan of an oral biography I had done called Milking the Moon about Eugene Walter, whom he had known. So he just started in on this explanation for why he loved this book. And I was just speechless. I couldn't utter a word because I wanted to tell him how much I loved his work.
Right.
And here Pat Conroy was telling me how much he loved mine.
Wow.
And that's what kicked it off.
Wow. What was it like the first time you met him in person?
Magical, because I was seeing a legend,
Yeah.
and I knew it. By the time I met him, he was already a myth.
Right.
And it was a bit overpowering just to be in the aura of that. But as soon as he actually starts interacting with you, he breaks the spell immediately and makes you feel like he's known you forever.
Yeah.
And he was like that with everybody. I've heard so many stories from people who just went up to him on the sidewalk and introduced themselves and stood there talking for hours, literally.
Really?
Yeah.
Really?
He was that kind of person.
So he was one of these guys that he liked people, genuinely liked people, huh? He did.
He
huh?
did.
Yeah.
Yes.
Neat,
Yeah.
neat.
Yeah. So that conversation we had on the phone, I like to say it's a conversation that never ended. Because we connected in that first phone call that was totally unexpected to me. I wasn't prepared to interview him. Instead, he was kind of interviewing me.
Interesting.
And so one thing led to another, and we just kept talking.
What did you, besides his talent as a writer, what did you like about him most? What did you most like about him?
His humanity. He was a celebrity. He was a star, but he really ran away from all of that. He really did not want to walk the earth as a famous person. And that was such a beautiful thing to see. Someone who just wanted to be a human being, didn't relish his stardom, did not care for fame, and did not like what fame did to people. So the way that he kept his humanity intact, the way that he kept his soul pure, was, to me, perhaps the most deeply impressive thing.
Do you think that made him a better writer?
I do, because I think he stayed in touch with real lives, real people. And he led what I would call a real life. He chose to live in Beaufort, South Carolina, which he called his hometown, even though he wasn't born there and wasn't really raised there.
Right. What do you think it was that he liked about Beaufort, South Carolina, as opposed to, say, I mean, he could have obviously been in Manhattan or Los Angeles or somewhere like, some major metropolitan area.
Right. He arrived there when he was 15 after having a military brat childhood and going all over the country. And he first really felt at home when he arrived at Beaufort. He felt that the community embraced him, and he loved the high school. So he said he decided to claim it as his hometown, and he did. Yeah.
We were talking off camera, and you said initially you did not want to do the oral biography on him. Why?
I really didn't. I was scared. I was flattered, I was honored, and I was excited that he thought I was worthy of doing a project with him. But the whole prospect of it really did intimidate me. For one thing, I did not see how I could produce a book that would be able to stand alongside the great Santini, the Lords of Discipline, and the Prince of Tides. And I didn't want to try and fail and have a failure to put up there on the shelf.
Right.
And the other thing, Jeff, was that by this point, Pat and I had been talking on the phone for years. I want to say about 5 years. By the time he said, if you'd been recording all these conversations, you'd have a book. And during that time, he had become my mentor. And that was so valuable to me. I had a mentor in high school who encouraged my writing, but when I went to college, I thought I'd have a mentor in college. I went to Harvard. It seems a reasonable assumption
Sure,
that you
sure.
might find a mentor there,
Yeah.
somebody who might steer your writing career.
You would think.
Yes. And I did not find a mentor in college. I went to Emory for graduate school and again thought, well, you know, have another crack at finding a professor or somebody on campus who can help me. Did not find a mentor there either. And I had kind of given up. And then lo and behold, I have this opportunity to get to know Pat Conroy. And over the course of our friendship, I realized he had become my mentor. He became a champion of my writing. And actually, he became my editor and my publisher as well when he started his fiction imprint at the University of South Carolina Press. And that relationship to me was so important. And I was afraid of doing something that was going to ruin that. I didn't want him to lose respect for me if I produced a book that wasn't good enough. And I didn't see how I could do anything that was good enough compared to what he had already done. And I was just intimidated by the whole prospect. And so when he first made that comment, I treated it like a joke. You know, I didn't really pick up on it, even though I was flattered, as I say. So it wasn't until he had his health scare and was afraid he was going to die that I realized he really wanted to do this, and I had to start looking at this in a different way. Not about what I didn't want, but about what he wanted and what he needed and what I needed to give back to him, who had given so much to me. And then, of course, when so we recorded our conversations in the spring and summer of 2014. By the time I had just finished the rough draft, he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. So all of a sudden, my attitude completely changed. I was so glad at that point that we had recorded those conversations and that I did have that material.
Did he have a chance to read the rough draft?
He did not. No. His doctors initially gave him a prognosis of 6 months. And I planned to go up to Beaufort with the manuscript once he got stable and comfortable and go over it with him. But unfortunately, he never got stable and comfortable, and he only lasted 6 weeks. So, but he did know it was finished.
For people who don't completely understand, talk about sort of the format and what an oral biography is.
That's a great question because it is a very different genre. The way I do it, it's a book that no one has written. Pat Conroy did not write the book. I didn't write the book. I recorded these conversations with him, and most of them did take place over the telephone. A few we did in person, but most were recorded over the phone. And then those recordings were sent to a professional transcriptionist who transcribed every word that I said and every word that he said. And then I get all these raw transcripts back. I get hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages back from the transcriptionist. And I start going through the transcripts with a highlighter, Xing out passages that I know I don't want to use, highlighting passages that I think might end up in the book. And once I've done all my highlighting of all the transcripts, then I start trying to figure out what goes where and what stays in and what really doesn't belong after all. And so that what appears on the page are Pat's spoken words. And it's a great way to capture a raconteur. And Pat was as great a raconteur as he was a writer. And so I'm really glad that there is this book that has captured that aspect of him.
Now that you're finished with it and you've looked back at it, what do you think? Are you proud of it?
I am proud of it because it does sound like Pat. And especially now that he is gone, I feel the book did succeed in its mission, which was to preserve that voice, preserve that character, that personality. For those who never met Pat, the idea is you can meet him now in the pages of this book. It gives you a chance to encounter this person, this very special person.
As you were going through this process, what surprised you most during the process? What did you learn about him that you went, wow, I wouldn't have thought that, or that surprises me?
That's another great question, because I didn't get to bring this out in the book the way that I'd like to. There was one interview, and I really didn't even look at them as interviews. They were more like conversations. But I asked him, Pat, what are the 5 greatest moments or experiences of your life? So he started rattling off all these things. Okay, one was, you know, his the trip he took after he first started teaching at Beaufort High School with his fellow teachers. Yes, he rattled off all these experiences. 2 of his greatest experiences had to do with basketball games he played for the Citadel. Another great experience was his first year teaching at Beaufort High School. So I get this list of his favorite things, and I said, Pat, do you realize that on this list there's nothing after you've all of your favorite experiences happened before you'd ever published a book? And he just roared with laughter. He said, I never realized that. I said, so Pat, let me get this straight. So the publication of your books, The Great Santini, The Prince of Tides, that doesn't make it into your top 5? He said, nope. What about the movies that were made of those books? Nope. That didn't make it. And so that spawned a whole conversation about how his publishing career and then the career of his books being made into movies was very stressful, especially because his books caused such explosions. The Great Santini caused a great explosion in his family. The Lords of Discipline caused an explosion with his college, the Citadel. And that put him under great stress. And he really took it to heart. And he was always having to fight off attacks. His family attacked him for The Great Santini. Not his siblings, but his parents and his grandparents. His college attacked him for The Lords of Discipline, and he was having to defend himself and fight off these attacks. And none of his publishing experiences were pleasurable. And that was really eye-opening to me. And it kind of also tallies when I asked him for the list of the 5 worst things that ever happened to you. And let's put aside the abuse you experienced from your dad. Give me the 5 worst things other than that. And number 2 was getting fired from Defusky Island, from his teaching job there. And I said, oh, come on, Pat. I know you couldn't be a teacher anymore after getting fired, but didn't the fact that you became a best-selling novelist, beloved by millions, didn't that compensate a little bit for not being able to be a teacher? He said, not really. He said, I was very happy being a teacher, and I thought it was a great life. And that really woke me up too, that he was happier then before he published any of his works. That's even though he experienced fame, success, riches with his books, it didn't necessarily make him happy. And he would say certainly not happier than he had been when he was a teacher. And what impresses me about that is that he could tell me that. That he wasn't so caught up in projecting the image of success.
Talk a little bit, you mentioned his father, you mentioned his family. Talk a little bit about the relationship with his father.
Well, that was perhaps the most fraught relationship of Pat's life. His father was a Marine fighter pilot. and an abusive personality. Pat liked to say that he was either waging war on America's enemies or he was waging war on his family when he was at home. And Pat was the first child, the oldest son, and I think the father viewed Pat as a threat, as competition. And you know, Pat's earliest memories are of, number one, seeing his mother beat up by his father, and then number two, getting slapped around himself. And I think this marked Pat's entire existence. And it became the foundation of all of his writing.
Mm. This
was a wound that he was always trying to heal.
You think he ever did?
He would say that he didn't. That was, there's a line in our book where he says, you really cannot make up for that ruined childhood. That is just something that you can't cure. He tried to write his way out of it to a place where he could find some peace, which I think he did by the end of his life.
His father, what did his father have to say after all of the success that Pat had? Did he ever come around with a different way of looking at him?
He did. Pat said his father had the greatest second act of fatherhood that he's ever heard of. Pat said that with the great Santini, he showed his father an image of himself that his father didn't like and that his father tried to refute. So Pat says his dad spent the rest of his life trying to prove to the world that he wasn't the Santini figure of that novel. And Pat said he developed a sense of humor, and he also developed a sense of loyalty to Pat and to Pat's writing career. And he would go around bragging that he was really the source of Pat's success because he was Pat's greatest character.
And how did Pat take that?
I think Pat enjoyed it. I mean, at least finally he was having some camaraderie with his father that he'd never had growing up.
What kind of friends did Pat have?
Pat had great friends. Pat had a lifelong friend named Bernie Shine that he met at Beaufort High School. And Pat and Bernie were best friends from the age of 15, 16, up until Pat died. And that's one of the best parts of this book is the description of their lifelong friendship. Bernie was a wild character, and Pat was at first a very straitjacketed altar boy Catholic. And he talks about how Bernie Shine helped break him out of the straitjacket. It's a great story.
What kind of personality was Pat when you would get him, say, you know, at the bar or somewhere, you know, after hours, or what kind of guy was he then?
Pat was just a storyteller. He just would tell one story after another. But the great thing about Pat is that he really wanted to hear about you. You would find yourself becoming a storyteller when you were around Pat because he would dig it out of you, and before you knew it, you would be telling him the story of your life. And you would be telling it to somebody who really was listening, who really wanted to know, and who cared, and who would remember. I mean, Pat was very special that way.
Interesting. What is your favorite book of his?
That is tough. I want to say The Lords of Discipline is probably my favorite. For a lot of people, it's The Prince of Tides. I like the Lords of Discipline has a very tight plot, and it's very well executed. And Pat has a line in that book where the main character says, "I shall bear witness to all the injustices and the cruelties that he is noticing in this military college regime that he is struggling with." And I think Pat does bear witness in this book to something that needed to be told, something that needed to be articulated. And I think he made a difference with that book. I think he did the same thing to an extent with the great Santini as well, because the whole issue of abusive parents or dysfunctional families had not really come out into the open when Pat was writing that novel. And so I think he did, with those two novels, The Great Santini and The Lords of Discipline, I think he really did a good job of bringing issues out into the open that had existed behind closed doors.
I have about 2 minutes left.
Okay.
Let me talk just a little bit about your novels.
Okay.
So I think last time we talked, you just said you just published your first novel, if I'm not mistaken, and since then several more, right?
3 more have come
Okay.
out, yes. The first one was The Headmaster's Darlings, which Pat wrote the foreword for. The second one was All the Governor's Men, and Pat wrote the foreword for that as well. Then The Harvard Bride and The Ex-Suicide.
Okay. Any more?
I hope so. I hope so. I had to switch from fiction writing to do the oral biography with Pat Conroy. So I had to switch from listening to my own voice and getting that down on paper to immersing myself in Pat Conroy's voice and getting that down on paper. And I need to switch back now. But it's hard, and there's a part of me that doesn't want to let go of Pat's voice.
I bet. What a great story. This oral biography on Pat Conroy is told by as told to Katherine Clark,
Yeah.
and of course I'm sure available at all the usual
That's right.
book places, Amazon, and
That's
that type
right.
of thing.
The first printing has sold out.
Okay, awesome.
But the second printing is underway.
That's great. Katherine, great to see you again.
Great to be here, Jeff.
Thank you so much
Thank
for coming
you.
back. Katherine Clark, who is a great novelist in her own right, and has done a wonderful job with Pat Conroy's oral biography. She's got a couple other oral biographies out there as well, so I would invite you to check those out at Katherine's website, KatherineClarkBooks.com. By the way, you can find our first interview with Katherine and many more of our conversations online at WSRE.org/conversations, as well as on Facebook and YouTube. I'm Jeff Weeks. Thank you so very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the broadcast. Take wonderful care of yourself, and we'll see you soon.
Support for this program is provided in part by Gulf Power, a Southern company, and by viewers like you. Thank you.